Okay, so we are now about to begin chapter 18 of part 2. And if you remember, in chapter 17, Rambam uh, disproved all of the proofs that the Aristotelians had for the eternity of the universe. And all of the scientific proofs were based on the observations that they had of science. So basically, by looking at the way things are in the world that we live in, they extrapolated that the world had to have always existed. And Rambam basically knocked out all of those proofs. There was a whole bunch of them by stating that operates under the assumption that prior to the universe, whatever prior even means, that there was that the same rules applied. He said, but Rambam said, but that doesn't make sense because the rules of physics with which the world is governed were also created at the time of creation. They didn't exist prior to that. So that's how he knocked out all of those. But then he said there were 3 other proofs that the Aristotelians used, which were proofs based on the nature of God, right? And those proofs, he couldn't use his scientific rejoinder. He needs to come up with another explanation. So, and he's going to go through those 3 now in this chapter 18. So I'm just going to remind you of the 3 what they were. The first one is that God can't change, right? So if God can't change, so whenever anything happens on this world, that's potentially, like I could potentially make a table right now. There is no table yet, but then I go ahead and I get the wood and I prepared and I put a table together. I just made it from potential to actual, right? So the world, now if God can't change from potential to actual, how is it possible, right? That he should decide, one day to God changed. Before he was not a creator. There was no world that he had made. Now God became different because now he made a world. So that was the first proof. The second proof that they said was that if the world is perfect, right, why would God choose at certain moment? If, in other words, with the assumption that God's creation is perfect, there can't be flaws in his creation. So then why would he choose today or yesterday or 15 million years ago or 15 billion years ago to create the universe, right? He should have done it 16 billion years ago or 17 billion years. All the time, it's perfect. He should have always been making the world. So why all of a sudden pick the creation at a certain particular junction? That was their second proof. And their third proof was, right, if God is perfect and his acts are perfect, right? So then the world should always exist. And we're going to go into a little bit more details, but those are the 3 things. Rambam is going to bring each one, and then he's going to explain why these things are not good proofs. That's the subject that we're about to study. And you'll see there's going to be a common denominator that I'm going to bring out, which is important, which is important, I think, even when we think about the world in terms of modern science, as opposed to the Aristotelian science that Rambam was used to, there'll still be a lot for us to learn from the basic idea that Rambam is putting out there. So let's start the beginning of chapter 18. We are on page 299 in volume 2 of the Pines translation. The first method they mention is the one through which, in their opinion, we are obliged to admit that the deity passed from potentiality to actuality. In other words, if this is what they would come to us. We say the world was created. So then, if that's the case, then God had a potential to act at one point, and then he became an actor at another point. So he changed from being a potential actor to being an actual actor, right? In as much as he acted at a certain time and did not act at another time. So there was a change in God. And how could you say that there was a change in God if God can't change? So the way to destroy this doubt is most clear. It's easy to knock off this proof, and I'll explain how. For this conclusion necessarily follows only with regard to everything composed of matter. You're going to hear some very strong similarities between this and what he argued before, right? When I use my example of the table, and Rambam is going to use some other examples, right? Which is endowed with possibility and a form, right? So every bit of matter, a hunk of wood, right, can become something else. It is potentially can be made into a chair or a table, right? And also it has a different form, right? The matter has remember the chomer and the tzura, the form and the substance, which Aristotle believed every matter has, right? It has a certain, it's made of a certain substance, and then it takes the form of whatever form it's taking, a chair, a table, a tree, whatever it is. So when such a body acts in virtue of its form not having acted, right? So after not having acted, there was indubitably in it a thing that was in potentia, and afterwards made the transition into actuality. So the tree had in it properties which it was a potential table, and then something happened, and now it's a table, right? So accordingly, it undoubtedly must have undergone the action of something causing it to make this transition. So something must have decided, I'm going to cut this tree down, I'm going to cut it into boards, I'm going to bang the boards together, and I'm going to make a table, right? For this premise has been demonstrated only with regard to things endowed with matter. That idea that the tree has potential to be a table, and now it is a table, and something changed in it, is only true when you're talking about something that has matter, something that has substance. On the other hand, that which is not a body and is not endowed with matter, when we're not talking about something that you and I can measure, something that you and I can see, feel, touch, taste, whatever, it's not matter. It doesn't actually, it's not something that we can ascribe qualities to it. So then it's not true. Thus, all it has is always an actu. That the thing, whatever that thing is, and Rambam is going to define it a little bit, but we're never really going to understand what it is, right? Always has the active ability to do whatever it is that it's doing, right? So accordingly, with regard to it, their contention does not necessarily follow. It is not impossible with regard to it that it acts at a certain time and does not act at another time. It doesn't change, right? It's always able to do whatever it's able to do, right? It's always doing whatever it's doing, right? It doesn't, there's no change in that thing. And again, so it's very similar to the way he knocked out those ideas in the last paragraph, in the last chapter, when he talked about the physical proofs, the scientific proofs. In other words, again, the premise is that when we're looking at matter, it's true, this idea that something changes from potential to actual. But when we're talking about God, right, the whole concept of changing from actual to potential doesn't make sense, because we don't know what it means when we talk about God, right? It's not a measurable entity. It's not a godness that we can put a godometer and figure out how much God there is there. It doesn't work that way, right? So to say that it changed doesn't make sense. The whole idea, the whole concept of this potential actual stuff only applies with matter. So then the Rambam goes and uses the proof of what's called the active intellect. Now, a little bit of a side, what's his name? Aristotle talks about this concept of the active intellect. And it reminds me a little bit of when you learn about like Freud's ego and id and whatever, like different concepts in the brain and the mind, right? Aristotle had his own idea of the active and the passive intellect. But and then the Aristotelian philosophers that followed him explained what he meant by active intellect in various different ways. One of the most prominent was Al-Farabi, who Rambam has quoted numerous times, Abu Nasr Al-Farabi, who explained, and it doesn't really matter to go into the depth of this Aristotelian idea that much. However, Al-Farabi explained that and one of the articles that I read, trying to get a little bit of a grasp of what it is.
I have snacked just a little bit, but I have to find it.
I'm sorry, I just forgot to mute all the things. So we had a hot mic there. So Al-Farabi explained the concept of the active intellect is that which takes potential intelligibles and makes them actual intelligibles. So what does that mean? That means that there is an entity. Some of us might call it a soul sometimes, right? But it's something. It's an intellect in our minds, right? Which thinks of something, right? Before, I wasn't thinking about a pink elephant, right? Now I'm thinking about a pink elephant, right? So that idea of a pink elephant was, before I thought of it, it was floating around somewhere, right? But now it was nowhere. The active intellect made it something. It made it a thought. Before, it wasn't a thought. It didn't exist. It was a potential intelligible. Now it is an actual intelligible. So there's something within my brain called the active intellect. And that's the thing which Aristotle called the active intellect, according to the way Al-Farabi explained it. So I gave that little background so we can understand this next paragraph. But before I read it, that active intellect is not made of matter, right? And think about it for a moment. That now it's starting to come together. Remember, we talked about how according to Rambam, the spheres around the world had intellects, right? Right, and those intellects were influenced by the intellects above them, and that those intellects are what we call malachim, or what we call angels, right? So that active intellect is within us, right, which connects to the intellect above it, which connects to the intellect above it, and so on and so forth. We're starting to get a little bit closer to the idea, which we're going to discuss in detail later on. We're not there now, of how prophecy works according to Rambam. But the idea is that this active intellect is a scientific being in Rambam's mind. It's a scientific thing which was identified by Aristotle. Okay, so that active intellect, Rambam is about to tell us, and I'm giving a heads up, is about to tell us that it doesn't change, right? When it says, I am now going to think of a pink elephant, the active intellect didn't change. It's not composed of matter. It's not that something that was potential became actual. It had in it the ability to think of pink elephants all the time before and all the time after, right? It was the same. No change happened in it. It's not like matter, which we can say changed. And that's the point that he's about to bring. In the same sense, right, God, right, and Rambam is going to use that as a metaphor to explain God. He's going to, of course, remind us that this isn't actually understanding God, but it's a way to get a grasp of the idea that God doesn't change because he all of a sudden, for whatever reason, decided to create a universe. So here I'm going to read it. A proof is provided by the active intellect as it is conceived by Aristotle and his followers. For the active intellect, on the one hand, is separate from matter. On the other, it acts at a certain time and does not act at another time. So it's not matter, right? Like we said, God is not matter. But it also acts sometimes and sometimes doesn't act, as Abu Nasr al-Farabi explained in his treatise called On the Intellect. For there he has set down a statement that runs literally as follows. He says, if you think of it as the entity within our souls, the deepest part of us, the observer within us, right? In a lot of the mystical traditions, there's I feel something, but something felt it, right? Who's that thing that felt it? If you keep going deeper and deeper, it's that intellect all the way that deep down that makes the decision, that makes the observation, that sees the thing that's seen, right? That decides to think the thing that it's thinking, right? It is clear that the active intellect does not always act, but it acts at a certain time and does not act at another time. This is literally what he says, and it is clearly true. But even if this is so, it cannot be said that the active intellect undergoes change, or that it was acting potentially and became actual because it did something at a certain time which it didn't do before, because there's no relation between bodies, right? Nothing actually changed, right? It only makes sense to talk about change when you're talking about a thing, and it's not a thing, right? It's not a body, right? That was not a body. There's no resemblance in respect either at the time of their acting or at the time of abstention from acting. I'm sorry, I'm reading quickly because I said the point several times. In fact, the act of forms endowed with matter and the act of a separate beings are only called act by equivocation. In other words, remember Rambam's idea that terms have equivocal meanings. We only use the word act, right? That the active intellect is active and acts because we have no other term to use, right? So we say it acts, but it doesn't actually act, and not deliberately using that ACT root often, right? Hence, it does not follow that if a separate being does not accomplish at a certain time that act which it accomplishes later, that it had passed from potential to actuality, as we find it to follow in the case of forms endowed with matter. That's the difference. Perhaps, however, someone may think that this speech contains something misleading. Now, here it gets a little bit complex, but very interesting and important. I don't want you, Rambam says, to make the following mistake. I might have misled you, and I want you to be careful, and I'm going to make sure you don't mislead. I'm not misleading you. For if the active intellect necessarily acts at a certain time and does not at another time, this does not result from a certain cause subsisting in its essence, but from the disposition of the portions of matter, right? So, in other words, if the active intellect decides to act now and not yesterday, right? It's doing it because something outside of it, some matter changed, right? For its action is perpetual with regard to all things properly disposed. Hence, if there's an obstacle to this action, right? Let's say the active intellect decides I'm going to go buy a pet elephant. And then you go to the pet store and they're not selling elephants, right? So now you can't buy an elephant. So the active intellect is then now not able to fulfill that thought that it had, right? This is an obstacle. So he who thinks thus should know that so don't make this mistake, right? That God works the same way. In other words, I'm comparing the active intellect to God, but don't make the mistake to think our purpose is not to give information as to the cause for which God may be exalted, had acted at a certain time and not acted at another time. Don't continue my comparison and think that the active intellect, just like it responds to physical phenomenon, that God does the same thing, because that's not how it works, right? But the active intellect itself stays the same. It's just the changes are happening with and around it. We did not pursue this example to a conclusion, right? We did not say that just as the active intellect acts at a certain time and does not at another time, so God may be exalted can do the same. We have not said this nor drawn this conclusion, right? If we had done this, it would indeed have been misleading. Why would it have been misleading? I'm going to explain outside, because it would have misled you to think that God is then reacting to an external cause. So be careful when you make this comparison. But the conclusion that we have drawn, however, but the main point I'm trying to make now, says the Rambam, and this conclusion is correct, is that though the active intellect, which is not a body or a force in a body, acts at one time but is not at the other, whatever the cause may be, and let's not get into that right now, it is not said of it that it is passed from potential to actual, nor that there subsists possibility in its essence, nor that it needs something causing it to make the transition from potentiality into actuality. Okay, so that's the bottom line. Thus, we are relieved from this great doubt. So I knocked out the first thing, right? Whereas for us, we believe that he may be exalted is neither a body nor a force in the body. So therefore, you can't worry about this actual to potential problem. And hence, so that's that. Now, the second method, right, is responding a little bit to, remember, he said, I don't want you to make the mistake and think that God is reacting to external circumstances, right? So that leads us to this second thing. The second method is the one in which eternity is shown to be necessary. So the Aristotelians tried to prove that the world always existed because there do not subsist for him any incentives, right? Remember, the active intellect, when the person's hungry, the active intellect says, I'm going to go to the grocery store and buy a sandwich, right? Right. But and when it's cold, it says, I'm going to go to my closet and get my jacket, right? But God doesn't respond to those needs. God doesn't have needs, right? So how could God have been responding to saying, oh, now conditions are perfect so that I need to make a world now, right? I need to make a universe. It doesn't make sense. God doesn't respond to external needs, incentives, right? So it must be that the world has always been, okay? So now, no. So now the Rambam has to take on this objection. Know that every agent endowed with will who performs his acts for the sake of something must of necessity act at a certain time and not at another time. So he says an example, a man decides to build a house. Let's say he has all the things he needs. He has all the wood and the nails and the screws and everything he needs to make a house, right? And I'm going to kind of just read this a little outside till the top of page 301. And then but he doesn't need a house because it's warm outside. It's nice and sunny. It's 80 degrees. There's a breeze. I don't need a house, right? And then all of a sudden it starts to rain and he says, oy vey, I need a house. So then he can go get his things and he makes a house, right? So he's responding to external needs, right? So this only occurs when acts, but this idea, right, that a person has to do something when acts are in the service of something external to the essence of the will. Like you and I have will, right? We want to do something, right? But that will is always responding to some sort of external need or some sort of external stimulus, right? However, the act, however, the act has no purpose whatsoever except to be consequent upon will. In God's case, God's will is not serving any purpose. There's no need that God had. His will to make a universe is not a response to anything, right? So the one who wills is not obliged, even if there are no impediments, to act always. God can decide to do it or he can decide not to do it. And it makes no difference. There's no difference to anything external to God, right? So, for there is no external end for the sake of which he acts that would render it necessary to act. Okay? So, the act is consequent upon the will alone, right? So somebody might object, okay, well, that's true. So fine, God is only acting based on will alone and not responding to external things. But that itself For whatever reason, 15 billion years, I think the Big Bang was around 15 billion years ago. Someone correct me if I'm wrong. That's why I'm using that number, 15 billion, right? God could have decided, right, 16 billion years ago to make the world, but then he decided 15 billion years ago to make the world. Now, prior to 15 billion years ago, and then after 15 billion years ago, there was a change in God, right? Because God, all beforehand, he didn't will it yet, and afterwards he willed it, right? So you have a change, and not only is it changed, so even though you're telling me that God's will willed it without responding to anything, something changed. So we'll respond as follows: no, for the true reality and the quiddity of will means to will and not to will, right? If the will in question belongs to a material being, right? So like you or I, so that some external end is sought. Whenever we decide to do something, we're trying to accomplish something external. Then the will is subject to change because of impediments and supervening accidents. Then you can say your mind changed. Today, now I'm hungry, so I want to eat. I finish eating, now I'm tired, I want to sleep, right? So the will changes because you're responding to external things. God's will doesn't change at all, ever, right? Because it doesn't respond to external things. So once you take out the response to externals, speaking of the change in the will makes no sense anymore, right? So the fact that it may wish one thing now and another tomorrow doesn't constitute a change in its essence. Nothing changed. The only way things can change is if you're responding to external stuff, and God's will doesn't respond to external things and does not call for another cause, just as the fact that it acts at one time, just like I told you in my first response, that acting now and not acting later does not constitute a change, right? So the same thing here. It doesn't constitute a change in God's will. It shall be explained later on that it is only by equivocation that our will, and this is an important point again, and Rambam said it before, when you and I say will, when I talk about my desire to eat a sandwich, right, and then I compare it with God's desire to create a universe, they're not the same. We're not comparing God has a big powerful will because he can make universes, and I have a little will because all I can do is eat sandwiches, right? But where there is no the next line for that of it being separate from matter are both designated, even though that you and I, my will is not separate from matter. My will is somewhere in my brain bouncing around, right? Whereas God's will is not related to matter whatsoever. There is no likeness between the two wills. We can't really compare them. We're just using it as a language because we're trying to do our best to understand it. But we cannot compare the two. Thus, this objection has likewise been invalidated, and it has been made clear that no incongruity necessarily follows for us in consequence of this method. So again, the same point, and this is really the bottom line for this whole chapter, right? All of their objections are making the assumption that God's will is like our will. God's acts are like our acts, right? And the Rambam is disabusing us of all those notions. Any philosophical concept that we try to say, well, because this and this and this is true, therefore it has to be true that God is X, Y, Z, B, A, B, C, whatever it is that you're trying to say about God, doesn't work, because God is not something that anything we apply to God, we can't make a comparison to anything that we can see or measure or sense or explain with scientific rules. The third method, it is the one in which they argue. So now what was their third objection? They argue that the eternity of the world must be necessary because everything with regard to which wisdom decides that it should come forth, right? So this is talking about God's wisdom. So the first one was God's actions, right? The second one, and we talked about potential and actual. The second one was God's will, and we talked about the change in God's will. And the third one is God's wisdom. In other words, the wisdom of the idea. Was it a good idea to make a world or not? I see a hand up. I'm sorry. I'll stop. Go ahead.
Well, it's just this last discussion, there's one step that I missed. Mm-hmm. I thought we were trying to establish that that the world is eternal. And so if the world is eternal, why are we getting into these points?
No, we're not. We're arguing that the world is not eternal, right? Rambam the Aristotelians proved that the world is eternal by these thoughts. And the Rambam is coming to say that no, the world was created ex nihilo, something from nothing, right? And he's saying these philosophical proofs that Aristotelians tried to use, the Rambam is coming to tell us that they're not proofs.
I see. Okay.
Right. Okay.
Okay.
All right, so all those two proofs, in other words, the first proof of the Aristotelians was, right, that God can't change from potential to actual, so it must have been always around. And the Rambam said, no, you can't say that, because that whole idea, that philosophical idea that God can change, that from potential to, I'm sorry, that God's decision to create the universe at a particular point in time would represent a change in God. Rambam says that doesn't apply, because the idea of change from potential to actual only applies when you're talking about matter, not when you're talking about God. And the same thing with God's will, right? We talked about God willed it. And why would he have willed it at one point and not another point? Well, doesn't that represent, a change? Because God decided, now he willed it before he didn't. So Rambam says, but that only applies when your will is responding to external stimuli. God's will is completely independent of external stimuli, right? So therefore, no change happened in his will. And the same thing, the next one is wisdom, right? In other words, for some reason, it was a good idea to make the world. And there's going to be some really, really cool stuff coming out of this. So let's just, I'm sorry, we'll do it, right? So for some reason, it was a good idea to make the world, right? We don't know, right, why, but it was, right? So for his wisdom is as eternal as his essence, right? So if it was a good idea, then why all of a sudden 15 billion years ago was a good idea and not 14 billion years ago or 16 billion years ago, right? So this is what the Aristotelians argue, right? So for his wisdom and its consequence, that which necessarily proceeds from it is likewise eternal. So if it is a good idea to make a world, then it must have always been a good idea to make a world, and therefore the world should have always been, right? There you go. That's their proof. So this is a very feeble way of going on to an obligatory conclusion. Why is it that it's feeble? It sounds great, right? Well, it's feeble because of the same thing. For in the same way as we do not know what was his wisdom in making it necessary that this, right? We don't know God's wisdom. We don't know why God made the world the way he made it, right? Just like I have no idea, Rambam says, why God decided to make the world with 9 spheres. Now, he was using Aristotelian science. You and I would say, I have no idea why God made water be made of H2O. I don't know why. He just did, right? We don't know why he made those rules, right? Neither more nor less. And the number of the stars equal to what it is, neither more nor less. Why are there 18 gajillion stars and not 18 gajillion and 1 stars, right? Whatever the number is. And that they should be neither bigger nor smaller than they are. Why is this one this size and that one this size? We also do not know what his wisdom in bringing it into the universe at a recent period after it's not having existed. We don't know why 15 billion years ago he decided. That wisdom is not something that you or I could measure or handle, right? So whatever his wisdom is that decides that the world is perfect, that same wisdom decides that 15 billion years ago should be the time, but it's not something that we'll ever be able to understand because we don't understand his wisdom. It's not logic like you or I think of logic, right? The universe is consequent upon his perpetual and immutable wisdom. But we are completely ignorant. I'm on page 302. This is a great sentence of the rule of that wisdom and of the decision made by it. We cannot even comprehend what that wisdom is and how God went about making these decisions, right? For in our opinion, volition too is consequent upon wisdom, right? Right? When you desire to do something, right? Why is it that I decide to walk to the grocery store and buy a sandwich when I'm hungry, right? So it's because I'm wise enough to know that the grocery store is where they sell sandwiches, and that sandwiches is gonna solve my hunger problem. So, and I know that if I walk, I'll get there, right? And if I bring along a few dollars, I'll get a sandwich. So all that is consequent upon a certain amount of wisdom. So that's all good with us, right? That everything is consequent, but that's not how it works with God. I mean, right? His essence and his wisdom, for we do not believe in attributes. For God, it's all one. It's different than us, right? The essence and his wisdom is the same thing. So we can't comprehend what that means, right? We don't know what his wisdom is. So you shall hear much about this notion when we shall speak of providence. When we talk about providence, which is often is called in Hebrew hashgacha, how God runs the world, so to speak, right? And this is a huge subject, and Rambam says we're going to talk about it later, right? By looking at the matter in this way, this disgracefulness, in other words, this argument of Aristotle is thus abolished. Okay, so again, the Rambam came with the same, the bottom line argument that he made is that our assumptions that are based on our philosophical ideas, right, can't be applied to God, because when we talk about God's wisdom or God's will or God's actions, we're talking about, something completely different than a human action or will or so on and so forth. And then the last thing that Rambam said 2 chapters ago was that Aristotle mentioned that everyone knows that, and this is going off a little bit on the way they understood science back then, right? Remember that according to Rambam, we learned this, the rotating the spheres were the active intellects, were the intellects attached to each one of those spheres that was deciding to make the spheres go round and round, right? And Aristotle, and those spheres, those intellects are the heavens. I'm sorry, are the angels, right? And they're in heaven, right? And Aristotle had mentioned that that for years and years, hundreds of millions of thousands of years of human existence, people have always assumed that the angels are in the heavens. So that seems like a proof that God must be up there, in the heavens, right, making it all go round, right? So something similar occurs in the external meaning of the scriptural text. We had this a little bit last time too, that when you look through the Torah, you also see hints in Tanakh of referring to God's dwelling in the heavens, right? When you look at the external meaning of that, this does not serve as an indication. So therefore, you might think that if the heavens are where God resides, then the heavens must be eternal because God is eternal, right? Don't think that's true, as he wishes to consider, because the Rambam makes very clear that the heavens are physical beings too, part of the universe that was created when the universe was created. So, but this has been said because it serves as an indication. However, why is it that the Torah referred to the heavens as the place? Because when we look at the heavens and we think about those the separate intellects, right, who are the spiritual beings and the angels, and the heaven proves to us the existence of the deity because something has to make it all move, which is a philosophical concept we'll get to a little bit later, but we also got into it before, that those intellects are being moved by the intellects above them and above them and above them, and eventually it's God that makes the whole thing go around, right? We learned that earlier. So we shall make it clear there is no proof indicating to us the existence of the maker according to our opinion, like the indication deriving from the heaven, right? That we cannot prove, right? We're going to make it clear. I'm sorry, I should have silenced my phone. I apologize. Give me a second. Where was I? Oh, so we shall make it clear that I'm in the middle of the second paragraph on 302. We shall make it clear that there is no proof indicating to us the existence of the maker, according to our opinion, like the indication deriving from the heaven, right? Which we're going to get to, right? Meaning that the most convincing proof that God exists is when we look at how the heavens move, okay? The latter also proves, as we have mentioned, according to the opinion of the philosophers, the existence of the mover of the heaven, right? And he's going to talk about that in more detail. But the bottom line is that everything moves. There must be a prime mover making it all move, which is an Aristotelian argument in which the Rambam and Aristotle both agree. After having explained to you that our contention is possible, and not as is thought by him who affirms the eternity of the world an impossibility, so now I have proven to you, right, that all of the proofs they were trying to prove that it's impossible that the world was created at a specific time. It's impossible that the world was created ex nihilo. It had to have always existed. And they used the scientific and the philosophical proofs, and I just knocked them out. Now I've achieved what I've been trying to achieve. And remember, what was he trying to achieve? To tell us that it is possible that we're right, that the Torah is possibly right. Philosophy and science do not disprove the Torah's idea, which is the idea Rambam attributed to Moshe Rabbeinu, right, and Avram Avinu, that the idea that the world was created by God at a specific point in time. Now I shall return in the chapters that follow to explaining that our opinion can be shown by means of speculation to outweigh the other in the scales. Now I'm going to show you what's the advantage of thinking like me over thinking like them. So at this point, they're both possible. They're both plausible. It could be the world was eternal and was never created by God, or it could be that the world was created by God, right? And I'm going to start proving to you that my idea, the Torah's idea, is better than theirs, right? And it outweighs them and making manifest the disgraceful consequences. And I'm going to show you what the problems are necessarily deriving from his opinion. The problems are going with Aristotle. So if you go with Aristotle, I'm going to show you what I don't like about them, and I'm going to show you that they're no good, and I'm going to show you why the creation of the world in time is good. So that is the end of this chapter. Now, I want you to think a little bit, because the Rambam is going to get into it. Actually, we have a little time. I'm going to start chapter 19. There's no way I'm going to finish it, but I do want to start it. Okay. But before I start it, let me answer any questions or hear any comments. Go ahead. Jeff, I saw you had a hand up.
So why can't we come to a bottom line here? I'm a bottom line person. We've just had a sentence, top of page 302, and you said it twice. Let me take it a 3 times. But we are completely ignorant of the rule of that wisdom and of the decision made by it.
Yes.
I love it because, okay, in the course of it, and I completely endorse it, but why don't we start and finish with that sentence for this entire discussion? Because before I opened this wonderful volume and took this course, if someone said to me, okay, let's explore why the world was created.
Okay.
I would say these 10 words, and I would say thank you very much, and that's what it was before. I have no idea, and there's no way that I have the ability to ever understand the rule, if you will, of that wisdom, the capital W. So why do we? Wouldn't he say if you accept that proposition, then there's really no need to explore any of this discussion?
I mean, I think this chapter really, why he chose to present it, the language that he presented, I can't tell you, but I can tell you that I think this chapter was really expressing the bottom line, right? Which is because he knocked off all 3 of these philosophical reasons, plus I think the 5 physical reasons, really by saying the same bottom line, which is that we can't apply the knowledge and wisdom that we derive from the natural physical world that we live in and use that to make proofs about God, right? Because it's totally different. And that really is the bottom line. And he could have said it, just like that, but we went through the process and now we really internalized the bottom line. Why he chose to write it the way he did, I can't tell you.
But why? But we accept that proposition, which is I don't know, self-evident. Maybe not so self-evident.
Yeah.
Spent a lot of time here. Why is he undertaking to even go into the question? Is it a possibility? Okay, so we're saying we don't know enough to come up with a definitive answer, which is a wonderful thing to know about. Why even bother?
Well, one of the things that it is true, and this goes back to one thing that Billy mentioned in the last week, because I told you that I was going to point out that the Rambam is never going to actually prove, right? And you see this from what he's going to do is he's going to show us that the Torah's view is possible, and then he's going to show us that it's probable, and he's about to embark on why it's probable. But at this point where we sit now, it's just as possible as Aristotle, right?
Okay.
Right? In other words, Aristotle's proofs I threw out. So now we did that. So now you and I are on an equal plane. And then I'm going to show you why the Torah is much, much better, because it's great. Its ideas are philosophically sound, and Aristotle's ideas are philosophically down there. But he's never going to get to the point, right? Right? Remember, it's clear from this language here, right? Explaining our opinion can be shown to outweigh the other in scales, right? But never be 1,000%, right? And not forget 1,000%. Will never be an absolute proof. Yosef, I see your hand up. Go ahead.
I just wanted to say that, Rambam was obviously writing for people who were trying to understand God, but the way that I was taught was that we're supposed to imitate God. So the fact that God can change his will, even though we don't understand what that means, is basically to give us an opportunity to learn that we too have that power to be like God and to choose the right way, even though we think that it's all preset and all that. So just wanted to add that.
And thank you for saying that. And there will be I can't remember which chapter it is. It's somewhere, I think, near the end of part 2, where Rambam goes into in detail the idea of the Latin imitatio Dei, the idea of imitating God. and the Gimel and how that plays in. But thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, so even though God actually doesn't change, but we may perceive it as change. And we can imitate the way we see God acting in this world. So now, any other comments on this chapter? Because I want, if there aren't, I'm kind of excited to do just the first two paragraphs of this next one, because we're going to get to something that is just so important, just so important. I think like a bottom line really gets to the most basic thing of what is the point of the idea of creation. Why does it matter so much, right? Who cares? Like, we can sit and debate these things, but the bottom line of religion, period, really, of belief in God, right? Why does it matter? And Rambam's going to say a couple sentences that just blows open at, like, according to Rambam, what the point is, right? But before we read that, think about it for a minute. Just I'm going to stop for a second, a moment of silence. Just think, but don't say. And you'll see if why does it matter if the world always existed and there's a prime mover up there making it all go around, but he's always making the world go around. The world's always going to be, always was, always is, always the same. Or that there was a point in time when God's wisdom dictated that it was time for the will to say, let's make a world. And then he acted and made a world, right? And remember, wisdom, will, acts, and God are all the same. And we don't understand what they are, all the things, whatever. But the bottom line is that at some point, that being that were with a capital B decided, and in decision-making processes that we can't even describe, but I'm using human words to describe something that we can't describe, to make a world. Why does it matter? Okay, I'm going to give a moment of silence. All right, now whatever thought you thought, hold that in your head and let's see how the Rambam says it. So remember, he just said, right, that it is clear to you from the doctrine of Aristotle, as well as from that which everyone who affirms the eternity of the world, if you believe like those that Aristotle, right, that the world is eternal, right? What does that mean, that the world is eternal? It means that the rules of science are the way they are. They always will be. So it's really science that dictates everything, right? The rules of physics, because Aristotle used the rules of physics to determine the nature of God, right? So by using the world of physics, Aristotle says those rules are immutable, right? They weren't created by God. They're just immutable rules that they just are. So in his view, that which exists has proceeded from the creator in virtue of necessity. So if that's the case, then God had to create the world the way he did, right? Because those rules Aristotle applied to God himself. Those rules had to be the way they are. The universe has to be the way it is. Maybe and there's a cause in this world and effect, and it was necessary that this should be so. So God being the cause of the world and the world being the effect of God had to be the way they are. Just as one does not ask with regard to him, may be exalted, why he exists or how he exists us. So we can't ask questions and say, why is it that certain, physical constants exist in this world that rule how physics and chemistry and biology, etc., work? We can't ask that about God, so it may not be asked about the world either, why it exists or how it exists thus. For all this, both the cause and effect exist thus necessarily. Non-existence is not possible, right? It can't be that the world didn't exist because it has to be this way, right? With regard to them in any respect, nor they're changing from the way they exist. Hence, it follows necessarily from this opinion that of necessity, everything must remain permanently exactly as it is according to its nature, and then nothing can change as far as its nature is concerned. For according to this opinion, it is impossible that a thing from among the existence should change as far as its nature is concerned. This is the nature of the universe, okay? Accordingly, no thing has come into being in virtue of the purpose of one possessing purpose. Here's the key thing. Listen to this. I'm going to read it. I'm going to go back at this sentence again. Accordingly, no thing has come into being in virtue of the purpose of one with a capital O, right? Possessing purpose, who chose freely and willed that all things should be as they are. There was never any moment, there was never any action, never anything that happened where some being said, I want to do this, right? No such thing ever happened, right? And if no such thing ever happened, for if they had come into being in virtue of the purpose of one possessing purpose, So the key word here is purpose. Then they would not have existed, right? And you just told me, Aristotle, that they always existed before they were right? Now, as for us, the matter is clear in our opinion that all things exist in virtue of a purpose and not of necessity. They don't exist because they're necessary, because that's the way it has to be, because that's the way the rules of science exist. They exist for a reason. Now, we don't know what that reason is. We don't understand the wisdom of God. We don't know the will of God. But there is a reason. There is a purpose. God made the universe for a purpose. He made us for a purpose. This is why it's so important, right? If God exists like Aristotle thinks, right, that it always is and always was and always will be, and everything is always exactly the same, then there's no point, right? There's no point to a world. But if the world exists and that he who purposed them may change them and conceive it, it's true. God could all of a sudden decide, I don't want a world like this. I want a world like that, right? He could, right? Right? God could have made the world in any way he could have made it at any time he wanted to do it. He could make it not exist, right? So I could see if he can think of another reason, though not absolutely any purpose whatsoever, right? Well, I'm going to get to that in a minute. Let me hold this thought here before I read the last sentence and a half. So you understand the difference here? This is so profound. I mean, this is the bottom line. Why it's so important. The bottom line is because if there's a moment of creation, then there's a reason why the world is here, right? There's a reason why we are here, right? Right? If there is no moment of creation, then there's no reason to be here. Then we're just here because we have to be. Let that sink in. And then we'll talk about the nature of impossibility. Maybe I might even start mid-sentence next time. From though not, I'll start next time. Because the idea of impossibility is a whole different concept. It's great, but I think we should leave it for next time, and I'll open the floor. Go ahead. If there's anyone, I see one hand up. So Jeff, go ahead.
Yeah.
Did you want to say something? If you don't, it's fine. I thought you did.
I was just talking about suicide. Sorry, I was talking about. I said when you first told us to pause, I was hoping we get some insight in the following two paragraphs, because I said if I don't have an answer, I'm going to commit suicide. Because if life is pointless, if the universe is pointless,
right.
So this is beautiful. The one thing I would add here, but the only thing that I'm still putting, and maybe hopefully we'll get an answer. Okay, so what Aristotle says can't be true because otherwise existence is pointless. So I might as well throw myself in the water. But the one question I hope we'll get answered is God, having started the universe, is this a sentient being that is good? Because unless we can come to the question not of whether,
well, so the answer to that, according to Rambam, first of all, is to use the term sentient being in the same sense that you and I mean when we're talking about a human being, and then we ask a question: is a chimpanzee sentient, or is my friendly cat Salome, who won't leave me alone right now, is she sentient? Right? I mean, so whatever the answer to those questions are, it definitely does not apply to God, right? Because anything that we talk about, God's will, God's wisdom, or in this case, God's sentience, right, is not something that we can relate to in any way, shape, or form, right? But God is a being that willed the world into existence. What that means by willed, we don't know, right? But for some reason, the world once didn't exist, and then it came into existence, right? If we back our clocks up 15 billion years, we'll get to the point, or whatever the number actually is, right? We'll get to a point where the world ceased to exist, right? If we went backwards in time, right? And we get to a point where there was no time even, right? So, there is God, whatever that means, that made that thing happen, right? For a reason, right? Because God decided for whatever reason that it should happen, and that it should happen in such a way that 15 billion years later, you and I should be sitting here learning more Nevuchim together, right? Right? And all of a sudden there's purpose. And that is so important. I mean, all of a sudden, everything we do has a meaning. Now, what's the meaning? Now, that's a whole different ballgame. But the first thing you need to say is that there is a meaning, right? And maybe life is all about finding that meaning, right? And well, what is that meaning? And that's obviously something that we all search for every day. But the bottom line is, go ahead.
Does he really make a good argument that there is a reason why the world is created? I mean, I'm not sure that he makes a solid argument that there's absolutely a reason why it was created.
Well, the very fact that the world was created means that God decided to do it, right? If it always was,
Okay.
right? Right? So that in itself means there must have been some reason. That reason wasn't an external reason, like you or I decide to eat a sandwich because we're hungry, right? God didn't decide to make a world because he needed to have a game to play and he was bored, right? That's not how it works, right? But for some reason, God completely from within himself, whatever that even means, willed a world into existence because of no external factors. God made and God decided that the world should be, right? That means there's a purpose to it all. It's just by its very meaning, it means he did it because it was the right thing to do or a good thing to do. So and then the rest of the universe, the rest of our lives is now devoted, once we come to that realization, right? Any other non-human existence, right? My cat is a sweet, wonderful cat, right? But she responds, everything is responding to external stimuli, right? The purpose of everything she does, right, is to affect a certain thing, right? But all of it, if we put it in our mind and think, well, wait a minute, we're not just here for those external things that are around us, but there's a deep purpose to all of this. It just creates a whole different, it's impossible. It creates a world in which religion can be conceived of, right? The idea of, or not just religion, but general, just finding purpose in our lives. And that's why, and this is like one of the most important, this is kind of like the midpoint of the whole book, is this paragraph. But there's obviously a lot more to go. But I'm glad we got to this, because I didn't want to let this tonight go by without getting here. And it's something we can all think about. There is a point. I didn't tell you what it was. I didn't provide you the answer of what the point is, but I did tell you that there is meaning, right? And there is a purpose, and we're going to learn a lot more about how to try to find a purpose. And maybe all of our lives is about that every day, but believe me or next time we study, we'll start from the middle of this. I'm going to put a marker in so I don't forget. We're going to talk about the impossible. I do want to tell you, and you can, there's just 2 sentences about the impossible. If you have time, I have a link to a podcast that I can email to you. Just text me offline, where you can listen about, can God do the impossible? It's a great podcast. Because you're initially think that if it can't be, if everything is possible for God. So the big question, can God create a rock that's too heavy for God to create? So it gives you these mind-bending, twisting things. So, and this guy has a great approach to it. So if anyone wants, I'll send you a link to that podcast. It's a fun thing to hear.
I don't know how do I text you? What do I text you?
So
when I text you on the WhatsApp, it says only the
no, Rabbi Dr. Show, you can post it on WhatsApp, and then we can all.
I'll post the link on the WhatsApp group, and then you can watch the video.
I can do that. Okay.
And I'll also
post
it. I have another texting group here in Alabama. I'll send it there.
Yeah,
if you have time, it's a lot of fun. If you have a 45-minute drive or something, and you want to tease your brain a little bit, listen to this podcast. It's great. It's really great. Okay, I'll send it out shortly.
You'll send it on the text also, because I don't think I'm.
Yeah, I'm going to send it out on the texts too. Yes. Okay.
Thanks.
Anything else, so that we can close up?
Thank you. That was amazing.
Okay. All right. Be well, everyone. Have a good evening, and Mirza Hashem will. I'll see you all on Tuesday at the National Mall.
Sorry, I'm
All
not
right.
gonna be there.
Okay, be well. All right, take care.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, so.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.